Recovered pict feeds from overrun Imperial positions rarely preserve a complete image of the organism. Most end before the subject enters full view. The first signs are indirect. Auspec's shadows lengthen across ruined armour columns. Static rises through Vox traffic as synaptic interference increases. Ground vibration registers before visual confirmation. Infantry testimony describes a moving mass above the smoke line, supported by limbs too narrow for the weight they carry yet strong enough to cross broken terrain without hesitation. The organism was later designated by Ordo Xenos records as the Hierophant. The earliest Imperial attempts to classify the creature treated it less as a single battlefield organism and more as evidence of a wider Tyranid developmental pattern. The Tyranid swarm had already demonstrated that its larger bioforms were not scaled versions of ordinary predators. They were purpose-grown solutions shaped by the hive mind's strategic requirements. A Carnifex could break a defensive line. A Trigon could rupture a formation from below. A Hardened could dominate aerial space while bearing lesser organisms into battle. The Hierophant belonged to a more extreme category. It was not introduced to support an assault already underway. Its presence often marked the moment when the swarm began confronting fortress-grade resistance directly. Its origins remain tied to the broader mystery of Tyranid macrobiology. No Imperial record describes a true founding in the human sense, because the Tyranids do not found institutions, houses, forges, or military orders. They express organisms, they test them through invasion, they refine them through consumption. The Hierophant appears to have developed as one of the hive mind's answers to worlds that could not be taken by infiltration, attrition, or mass infantry pressure alone. When a prey civilization concentrated its strength into void-shielded bastions, armoured divisions, macro batteries, or god engine formations, the swarm required a living instrument that could absorb catastrophic punishment while still advancing. The result was a bio-titan capable of challenging targets normally reserved for super-heavy engines and titan maniples. The strain's first noted encounter at Morale Prime gave Imperial observers a reference point, but not a complete explanation. Morale Prime did not reveal where the organism had first evolved. It only proved that the Hive fleets had already incorporated such a creature into their planetary assault cycle by the time Imperial forces began recording it in detail. That distinction matters. The Hierophant was not discovered in development. It was encountered in active use, already mature, already weaponized, and already integrated into swarm doctrine. By the time Imperial analysts could assign height, mass, threat category, and battlefield role, the Tyranids had already proven that the organism could survive long enough under heavy fire to make those measurements a luxury rather than a certainty. The Hierophant's development reflects the Tyranid habit of compressing several battlefield requirements into one living frame without making the organism feel like a simple collection of features. Its size placed it in the same strategic conversation as Imperial Titans, but its method of warfare was fundamentally different. An Imperial Titan is a sacred engine built through industry, ritual, plasma technology, void shielding, and centuries of institutional memory. The Hierophant is grown. It does not require a cockpit, a princeps, a maintenance cult, or a forge world supply chain. It advances as an extension of synaptic direction, carrying its own weapons as living systems. Where a machine must be repaired, the Hierophant can reknit damaged tissue if its internal reserves and the wider swarm's control remain sufficient. Where a Titan's weapons are manufactured and mounted, the Hierophant's armament is part of its biology. Imperial classifications usually place its average height around 15 meters, with a mass slightly above 53 tons. Some records use a lower height and weight estimate, which likely reflects the difficulty of measuring a hostile organism under combat conditions or the presence of variant strains across different hive fleets. The discrepancy itself is useful. It shows that the Hierophant should not be understood as a fixed military pattern, like a Baneblade chassis or a Mars pattern war engine. It is a living genus with adaptive variation. A specimen observed in one theatre may not perfectly match a specimen encountered elsewhere. The hive mind does not preserve design purity for tradition's sake. It preserves only what works. The organism's founding logic, if the term can be applied at all, lies in escalation. Lesser Tyranid organisms overwhelmed by number, speed, concealment, or specialized attack. The Hierophant emerges when the swarm requires intimidation, breach capacity, and sustained pressure against major resistance. Its appearance can change the tempo of an entire war zone. Defensive plans built around killing waves of smaller organisms become less reliable when a bio-titan crosses the kill ground. Artillery that would annihilate infantry broods may only slow it. Armoured companies that could contain medium bioforms are forced to reposition or concentrate fire. Commanders who treat it as a monstrous creature rather than a strategic asset usually lose the time needed to respond properly. The earliest meaningful development of the Hierophant in Imperial understanding came through battlefield aftermath rather than laboratory study. Wrecked fortifications showed impact patterns from biocannon discharge. Burned ferrocrete and dissolved plasteel indicated that its ranged weapons did not rely on conventional explosives. Survivors described corrosive organic projectiles striking with enough force and chemical violence to reduce armor, flesh, and structural material in seconds. The biocannon was not merely a gun grown onto a creature. It was a symbiotic weapon system triggered through electrochemical action within the host. This made the Hierophant dangerous at range before its mass and limbs ever reached the defensive line. Closer evidence proved worse. The underside of the creature, theoretically a vulnerability in a frame of such height, was protected by lashing tendrils capable of striking troops or vehicles that came too near. These structures made close assault unreliable even for forces trained to exploit weak points in larger targets. The toxic spores exuded from its armoured plates further reduced the usefulness of infantry engagement. A soldier close enough to plant charges or guide melter fire could be dead before completing the act. Even protective equipment did not guarantee safety, because the surrounding swarm often used the Hierophant's advance as cover for its own pressure. The bio-titan did not need to kill every nearby defender personally. It only needed to make the space around it unmanageable. As Imperial knowledge accumulated, the Hierophant became understood as a product of Tyranid strategic maturity. It represented an invasion phase in which the Hive Mind had judged the prey world's resistance worthy of heavier biological commitment. Its deployment implied access to vast biomass reserves and sufficient orbital or planetary control to bring such a creature into action. It also suggested confidence. The Hive Mind does not waste biomass casually. A Hierophant committed to battle means the swarm has assessed the target, measured the resistance, and begun applying a level of force intended to break the enemy's strongest remaining structures. This is why the Hierophant's origin cannot be separated from the Tyranid method of war. It is not a relic of a single world, a named creation of a forgotten artisan, or a battlefield accident elevated into doctrine. It is a deliberate expression of an intelligence that does not explain itself. Its development is recorded through the collapse of defensive lines, the silence of fortress guns, and the rare fragments of observation that survive long enough to be analysed. In those fragments, the Hierophant appears as one of the clearest signs that the Tyranid swarm is not merely numerous. It is capable of producing biological answers to the greatest engines of war fielded by its prey. The Hierophant's most distinctive battlefield quality is not simply its scale, though scale is the first thing most observers record. Its body rises high enough above ordinary Tyranid swarms that defenders often see it as a moving structure before they fully understand it as a living creature. It does not move like an Imperial engine. There is no mechanical rhythm, no exhaust pattern, no predictable gait produced by pistons or motive assemblies. Its movement is organic, but too large to feel animal in the ordinary sense. Each step transfers enormous pressure into the ground. Damaged stone, ferrocrete, soil, and armor plating may shift beneath it long before the organism reaches the firing line. Its frame gives it an unsettling contrast. The torso carries enough mass to place the creature in the same threat category as super-heavy war engines, yet the supporting limbs remain long, narrow, and sharply angled. This makes the Hierophant appear unstable to inexperienced observers. That impression is false. The limbs do not function as fragile supports. They are load-bearing biological structures reinforced for movement across broken battlefields. The creature can advance through shattered urban approaches, breach defensive works, and uneven terrain that would obstruct many conventional engines. It does not require roads, prepared ramps, or intact infrastructure. A fortress commander facing a Hierophant cannot assume that rubble will slow it for long. The surface of the organism is protected by thick chitinous plating. This armour is not uniform in the way metal is uniform. It grows according to biological stress, battlefield need, and the developmental pattern chosen by the hive mind. Heavy plates protect the main body and help absorb incoming fire, while exposed joints and flexible areas allow movement. Imperial fire discipline often attempts to exploit these junctions, but such targeting is difficult under battlefield conditions. The Hierophant is rarely alone. Smaller Tyranid organisms swarm around it, distort sight lines, and force defenders to split attention between immediate survival and the larger threat. The creature's ranged weapons are usually treated as its primary instruments of destruction. The bio-cannons mounted along its body are not external guns carried like equipment. They are symbiotic organs grown into the organism's warform. When fired, they use a massive electrochemical discharge to launch corrosive and venomous organisms at high velocity. The effect is not identical to a shell, missile, or plasma blast. It is a biological strike that combines impact, penetration, chemical destruction, and secondary organic lethality. Armour struck by such fire may be breached by force, then consumed or weakened by corrosive agents. Infantry caught near the point of impact may die even without a direct hit, because the discharge carries toxins and living ammunition designed to ruin flesh, armour seals, and exposed material. The Hierophant's weapon growth can vary between observed specimens. Some records describe long scything limbs suited for close assault. Others identify crushing claws capable of tearing into heavy targets once the creature reaches contact range. Cluster spines and other secondary bioweapons have also been noted, showing that the strain is not locked into one precise arrangement. This variation does not suggest confusion in its role. It suggests adaptation. A specimen expected to face dense infantry and fortified approaches may present different growths from one prepared to confront armoured engines or rival monsters. The hive mind does not decorate the Hierophant. Every growth exists because a previous battlefield made it useful. At close range, the danger becomes less about a single killing blow and more about denial of the surrounding space. Lash whips, when present, hang as living extensions of muscle and sinew. They can seize, entangle, or crush targets that approach beneath or beside the main body. This matters because large creatures often invite close assault from troops seeking blind spots. Against the Hierophant, those blind spots are not safe. A boarding action, demolition charge, or melter strike must pass through a zone of moving tendrils, smaller Tyranid organisms, and toxic atmospheric contamination. The approach itself becomes part of the kill mechanism. The toxic spores released from vents and ruptures across its armoured plates make proximity even more dangerous. These spores are not an incidental byproduct. They are a defensive system that punishes non-Tyranid life for getting too close. Infantry relying on courage, speed, or numbers can still be disabled before reaching an effective striking distance. Protective equipment may reduce exposure, but battlefield damage, seal failure, and prolonged contact make certainty impossible. In practice, the spores help the Hierophant maintain a lethal perimeter without needing to divert its primary attention from larger targets. Its tactical doctrine follows naturally from these traits. The Hierophant is not used as a wandering beast or a ceremonial terror weapon. It functions as a living siege engine within the swarm's wider assault pattern. The hive mind commits it where ordinary pressure has either failed or where immediate catastrophic force is required. It advances toward hardened positions, while the lesser swarm prevents defenders from concentrating cleanly. Gaunts, larger warrior organisms, aerial threats, and burrowing forms complicate the battlefield around it. By the time defenders recognize that the bio-titan is the central threat, they may already be dealing with breaches, panic, ammunition depletion, and collapsing command coordination. The Hierophant's doctrine is also psychological, though not in a symbolic or theatrical way. The Tyranids do not need morale displays in the human sense. The psychological effect comes from battlefield reality. A defensive line that has spent hours killing waves of smaller creatures may interpret the arrival of a Hierophant as proof that earlier resistance has not mattered enough. The creature's survival under fire forces commanders to reconsider their assumptions. Weapons that were decisive against lesser organisms become delaying tools. Strong points that seemed secure become temporary obstacles. Units that were assigned to hold ground may be forced into withdrawal simply because remaining in place means being crushed, dissolved, or bypassed. Against armoured forces, the Hierophant creates a targeting crisis. Super heavy tanks and Titan engines can engage it, but doing so requires concentration. Every shot directed at the bio-titan is a shot not directed at the rest of the swarm. If the defenders ignore it, the creature reaches decisive range. If they focus on it, smaller Tyranid organisms exploit the reduction in suppressive fire. This is one of the reasons the Hierophant is so dangerous as part of a coordinated invasion. It does not need to destroy every enemy asset personally. It forces the enemy to spend attention and firepower at a rate the swarm can exploit. Imperial responses generally depend on the heaviest weapons available. Large ordnance, Titan-grade firepower, massed artillery, and sustained bombardment offer the best chance of bringing the organism down before it reaches the defensive core. Even then, destruction is rarely simple. Its size allows it to absorb punishment that would annihilate lesser bioforms. Its body can continue moving after wounds that would cripple an ordinary creature. The swarm surrounding it may also recover biological material if the field remains contested, denying the enemy a clean strategic victory even when the specimen is eventually slain. The Hierophant therefore represents a mature Tyranid answer to the problem of fortified resistance. Its traits are not separate curiosities. Its height gives it line of sight and intimidation through presence. Its armour lets it remain under fire. Its biocannons punish hard targets before contact. Its tendrils and spores make close assault unreliable. Its variant growths allow adaptation across different war zones. Its doctrine binds all of these elements into one purpose: to breach what the prey believes is too strong to fall quickly. In that role, the Hierophant is not merely a monster on the battlefield, it is the swarm's declaration that the war has entered a heavier phase. The Hierophant does not possess personality in the individual sense understood by human observers. It does not make decisions from ambition, instinctive pride, fear, loyalty, or rage. Reports that describe it as hateful or deliberate are usually written from the perspective of survivors attempting to translate its behavior into familiar emotional terms. Such descriptions are understandable, but they are not technically precise. The creature's movements can seem purposeful because they are purposeful. Its attacks can seem cruel because they are efficient. Its refusal to retreat under punishment can seem fanatical because it continues advancing after injuries that would stop a machine, a beast, or a soldier. None of this proves a private mind. It proves synaptic direction. As a Tyranid bio-titan, the Hierophant exists as an expression of the hive mind's will. Its apparent temperament is therefore inseparable from the swarm intelligence controlling it. When it advances through sustained fire, the behavior does not suggest courage. It suggests that the hive mind has calculated the exchange and judged the loss acceptable. When it shifts its fire toward a fortress gate, a super heavy tank, or an exposed command node, the movement does not indicate personal recognition of value. It indicates that the target has been identified as useful to destroy. When it ignores fleeing infantry to continue toward a bastion, it is not showing restraint. It is following the priority structure imposed by the wider Tyranid assault. This distinction matters because Imperial commanders sometimes misread the Hierophant by treating it as an apex predator. A predator can be baited, a territorial beast can be provoked, a solitary monster may be isolated, exhausted, or distracted. The Hierophant is none of those things in any reliable way. It is dangerous because its behavior is connected to the whole invasion pattern around it. The creature may appear to choose a path, but that path usually supports a larger battlefield requirement. It may seem to hunt a particular engine, but the engagement often serves to open the way for smaller broods. It may appear to hesitate before a defensive line, but that pause may coincide with a shift in swarm pressure elsewhere. Its organizational alignment is absolute. It belongs to the Tyranid Hive fleets and functions only within the biological command architecture of the swarm. There is no evidence that a Hierophant can be negotiated with, redirected by conventional intimidation, or separated into independent service. Even when synaptic disruption weakens Tyranid coordination, a creature of such scale remains a catastrophic threat. Its body is still armed, armoured, and biologically engineered for war. Yet its full strategic value depends on the presence of the swarm. In isolation, it is an enormous organism. Within a hive fleet assault, it becomes a moving centre of pressure that draws fire, breaks fortified positions, and allows lesser organisms to exploit the damage it creates. The Hierophant's place in Tyranid organisation is not equivalent to command rank. It does not lead through authority, ritual, or battlefield prestige. Tyranid hierarchy operates through synaptic control, biological function, and swarm need. A hive tyrant may direct forces through synaptic dominance. Warrior organisms may act as local nodes of coordination. Lesser broods respond to instinctive and psychic impulses that bind them into the swarm's purpose. The Hierophant fits into this structure as a macro-level assault organism. It is not the mind of the offensive. It is one of the tools through which that mind imposes itself upon a resistant world. Its deployment also reveals something about the level of commitment behind an invasion. The hive mind does not appear to grow and commit such organisms casually. A Hierophant represents biomass, gestation, battlefield protection, and strategic timing. To bring one into combat means the swarm has either encountered resistance that demands extreme force or anticipates the need to overwhelm major defenses quickly. Its presence is therefore an indicator of escalation. A war zone in which a Hierophant has appeared is no longer dealing only with mass infantry predation, infiltration organisms, or medium assault strains. It has entered the stage where the hive mind is willing to spend vast biological resources to collapse the enemy's strongest positions. From an Imperial perspective, this makes the creature both a target and a warning. Destroying a Hierophant can prevent a breakthrough, preserve a fortress line, or buy time for evacuation and counterattack. However, the need to destroy it also exposes the scale of the crisis. Titan-grade weapons, super-heavy armour, concentrated artillery, orbital fire, or coordinated air assault may be required. Even then, the surrounding swarm must be contained at the same time. A commander who focuses every asset on the bio-titan risks allowing other Tyranid organisms to reach ammunition stores, command posts, generator stations, or retreat corridors. A commander who divides fire too evenly may fail to stop the Hierophant before it reaches decisive range. The personality attributed to it by survivors often emerges from this pressure. Guardsmen describe it as patient, because it does not rush when lesser creatures are already pinning the line. Tank crews describe it as vindictive because its bio-cannons can turn on armoured threats with sudden precision. Fortress officers describe it as inevitable because it keeps advancing through damage and smoke. These impressions are valuable as testimony, but they are not literal psychology. They are records of how the hive mind's decisions appear when expressed through a creature too large to ignore and too coordinated to dismiss as animal behaviour. The Hierophant also occupies a distinct symbolic position in Imperial battlefield memory. It is not as culturally mythologized as the greatest named titans of the Collegia Titanica, because Tyranid organisms do not preserve names, banners, or personal histories. Yet the effect of encountering one can become the central trauma of an entire campaign. A regiment may remember the day the horizon moved. A fortress command may record the failure of weapons believed sufficient against any landward assault. A Mechanicus detachment may preserve fragments of chitin, toxin residue, or weapon discharge as evidence of biological engineering beyond acceptable understanding. The organism leaves fewer stories of personality and more records of consequence. In conclusion, the Hierophant should be understood as a living siege organism, aligned entirely with the Tyranid Hive Mind. It has no confirmed individuality, no independent allegiance, and no personal motive beyond the function imposed upon it. Its observed behaviour is best explained through synaptic control, battlefield adaptation, and the strategic economy of the swarm. It appears where the Tyranids require overwhelming pressure against fortified resistance. It advances under fire because its loss may still serve the invasion. It destroys heavy targets because those targets obstruct consumption. It carries terror not because it seeks to frighten, but because its existence proves that the swarm can answer the strongest engines of war with living mass, directed purpose, and biological firepower. The Hierophant's significance lies in that final reality. It is not merely a large Tyranid organism, it's a demonstration that the hive mind can meet industrial warfare on its own terms without becoming industrial itself. Where the Imperium builds titans through sacred labour and ancient machine rights, the Tyranids grow an equivalent threat through hunger, adaptation, and accumulated biomass. The Hierophant stands as one of the clearest examples of that difference. It is not a commander, not a beast of legend, and not a warrior seeking glory. It is a weapon grown from the logic of extinction, released when a world has resisted long enough to require something heavier than the swarm's first answer. The first administratum impressions of the Hierophant were shaped less by complete study and more by the damage left after its passage. The organism was not initially understood through controlled observation. It was understood through failed defensive tallies, missing regiments, collapsed bastion lines, and casualty projections that became useless once the creature entered the main theatre of war. For clerks assigned to reconstruct campaign events, the Hierophant created a problem of scale. It could not be entered cleanly into the same threat category as ordinary monstrous organisms, yet it was not a war engine in the Imperial sense. It demanded Titan-grade attention while remaining part of a living swarm. This made its presence difficult to process within ordinary military accounting. Administratum records generally approached the creature through consequence. A battlefield that had held against lesser Tyranid pressure could become untenable within a short operational window after the Hierophant appeared. Ammunition expenditure increased sharply, not because defenders were firing carelessly, but because normal anti-infantry fire no longer answered the central threat. Heavy batteries were redirected, super heavy armour was forced to expose itself, reserve formations were committed earlier than planned, evacuation routes could become compromised when the creature's advance forced commanders to reposition entire lines rather than reinforce one breach. The Hierophant's value to the swarm therefore appeared not only in the targets it destroyed, but in the disruption it caused across the wider command structure. The Adeptus Mechanicus viewed the same organism through a different failure. Their concern did not begin with morale or casualty variance. It began with the uncomfortable fact that the Tyranids had produced a living analogue to God Engine warfare without metallurgy, plasma reactors, machine spirits, or forged temple inheritance. This did not mean the Hierophant was equal to every Imperial Titan in every engagement. The Mechanicus was careful, at least in formal study, not to mistake broad comparison for exact equivalence. What disturbed them was that the creature occupied the same strategic space. It could absorb heavy punishment, project destructive force across battlefield distances, and physically threaten fortifications or engines that ordinary biological forms could not reliably challenge. Observation logs from Mechanicus-aligned detachments placed emphasis on the creature's integration with the swarm. The Hierophant was rarely assessed as a solitary combatant. When pit captures showed one advancing secondary movement around its limbs, often revealed lesser organisms using the bio-titan's bulk as mobile cover. Smaller broods moved through fields of debris created by its weapons. Synaptic organisms repositioned while defenders concentrated fire on the larger threat. This suggested that the Hierophant was not merely deployed because it was large. It was deployed because its body changed the geometry of the battlefield. It created shadowed approaches, blocked lines of fire, and forced the enemy to reorganize around its movement. From an administratum perspective, this produced a severe logistical distortion. Every defense plan depends on assumptions about time. A commander needs time to rotate units, time to move ammunition, time to recite artillery, time to evacuate civilians or strategic personnel, and time to report changes up the chain of command. The Hierophant reduced that time. Its advance turned prepared depth into a shrinking measurement. Lines that were expected to delay the swarm for hours could be breached sooner if the bio-titan reached them before concentrated heavy fire could be arranged. Even when the organism was slowed, the resources spent slowing it were resources not spent containing the rest of the swarm. Some administratium after-action summaries treated the Hierophant as a campaign accelerant. This term, though administrative in tone, was strategically useful. The creature accelerated the collapse of sectors already under strain. It forced local commanders to reveal reserve positions. It encouraged premature use of strategic munitions. It created panic among units that had been trained to face Tyranid numbers, but not Tyranid bio-titanic escalation. It also complicated reinforcement requests, because a theatre reporting a Hierophant could no longer be considered a standard infestation front. Such a report implied the need for assets that might already be tied to other wars, including Titan support, Navy fire missions, orbital lance coordination, or rare super heavy armour. Mechanicus observations were often more anatomically precise, though no less troubled. They recorded the biocannons as integrated weapon organs rather than mounted equipment. This distinction mattered to their analysis. A damaged weapon system on a machine could be isolated, repaired, replaced, or re-sanctified. A damaged Hierophant weapon growth was part of the creature's larger biological system. If the organism survived, the wound might close enough for continued function, or be compensated for by other weapon growths. The Mechanicus could not treat it as a platform with components in the usual sense. It was a combat organism whose entire body was the platform. This produced several strategic findings. The first was that target priority could not depend only on visible weapons. Removing one biocannon might reduce the creature's ranged output, but it would not necessarily neutralize the threat. The creature's movement, toxic emissions, close-range lash structures, and sheer mass could still complete the battlefield purpose assigned to it. The second finding was that piecemeal fire was inefficient. Scattered heavy weapons might wound it, but without sustained concentration the damage could fail to halt forward pressure. The third finding was that the surrounding swarm had to be controlled at the same time. A commander who isolated the Hierophant in theory but not in practice risked losing the supporting battle. It is believed in some suppressed Mechanicus commentary that the Hierophant also served as a form of battlefield data expression for the Hive Mind. This remains unconfirmed because there is no evidence that the creature records information as a machine records telemetry. The belief comes from repeated observations that later Tyranid assaults seem to account for earlier anti-Titan tactics. If defenders brought massed artillery to bear in one theatre, later swarms appeared to use terrain, burrowing forms, or aerial pressure to interfere with similar concentrations. Whether this adaptation came from the Hierophant itself, nearby synaptic organisms, or the wider hive mind cannot be proven. The safe conclusion is that destroying one specimen does not guarantee future effectiveness against the strain. Administratum impressions also noted the morale effect, though official language often avoided terms that sounded too close to fear. The arrival of a Hierophant altered the behaviour of entire defensive populations. Civilian labour cohorts working ammunition lines became harder to control once the creature was visible from outer walls. Penal troops sometimes held longer than expected because withdrawal was impossible, while disciplined line regiments could still suffer cohesion loss if they saw heavy weapons fail to stop it. Officers reported that the organism's height made concealment difficult. Even when smoke, ash, or ruined architecture obscured the battlefield, its upper mass could appear through the haze, giving defenders a persistent visual reminder that the assault had not been contained. The Mechanicus' strategic finding was colder. Visibility was not merely a morale issue, it was a targeting issue. A creature large enough to be seen over defensive terrain was also large enough to draw fire away from smaller threats. This made the Hierophant both target and distraction. Its endurance meant that the distraction could remain effective for a long time. A weaker decoy would be destroyed and forgotten. The Hierophant forced sustained attention because ignoring it carried unacceptable consequences. In this way, the creature solved a tactical problem through durability. It did not need to hide. It only needed to survive while the rest of the swarm exploited the defenders' response. Some unconfirmed administratum memoranda proposed that worlds facing a Hierophant should consider earlier strategic withdrawal from exposed defense belts. This recommendation rarely survived into formal doctrine, because abandoning prepared ground before contact was politically unacceptable in many Imperial command structures. Even so, the suggestion reveals how seriously the creature was assessed. A fortified line is valuable only if it can trade space for time. If the arrival of a Hierophant converts that line into a trap, then holding it for symbolic reasons may feed the swarm more efficiently than controlled retreat. Such reasoning was often suppressed, not because it lacked logic, but because it sounded too close to defeatism. The combined administratum and mechanicus view therefore settled into a grim pattern. The Hierophant was not simply a large Tyranid creature to be killed when encountered. It was a strategic signal. Its presence indicated that the Hive Mind had escalated beyond ordinary predation and was now applying bio-titanic force to resolve a specific resistance point. Administratum officers saw the collapse of schedules, reserves, evacuation planning, and casualty expectations. Mechanicus observers saw a living war platform that challenged the assumed superiority of sacred industry. Both institutions reached the same practical conclusion. When a Hierophant appears, the battle has already moved into a heavier category of survival. The correct response is not admiration, panic, or disbelief. The correct response is immediate concentration of the strongest available force before the creature reaches the point where its existence becomes a breach. The resource profile of the Hierophant cannot be measured in the same manner as an Imperial armoured formation. An administratum ledger can calculate fuel, ammunition, promethium reserves, replacement parts, crew requirements, transport tonnage, and expected maintenance cycles for a human war engine. A Hierophant does not obey that accounting structure. It requires biomass, protection during maturation, synaptic direction, and a planetary theatre worth the expenditure. This makes it difficult for Imperial bureaucracy to assess as a conventional asset. It is not cheaper than a machine because it lacks metal. It is not simple because it is biological. It is the result of an invasion system that converts worlds, populations, ecosystems, and enemy dead into further military force. From the administratum perspective, this makes the Hierophant a sign of Tyranid resource confidence. The Hive Mind does not appear to commit such an organism without reason. A lesser infestation may rely on infiltration organisms, gaunt broods, warrior strains, and medium assault beasts. A full planetary consumption may introduce larger forms as the resistance hardens. The appearance of a Hierophant suggests that the swarm has either gathered enough biomass to support the deployment of bio-titanic organisms, or has determined that the strategic reward justifies the cost. In either case, the defended world is already under extraordinary pressure. The creature's presence implies that the invasion has moved beyond probing, raiding, or simple mass predation. The Adeptus Mechanicus studied the same issue from a more technical angle. A Titan requires a forge world, sacred manufacturing infrastructure, trained crews, machine cult oversight, reactor technology, void shield systems, ammunition supply, and a chain of rites and repairs that may stretch across centuries. The Hierophant requires none of these things in recognizable form. This does not make it primitive. To the Mechanicus, it makes the organism offensive in a deeper sense. It demonstrates a parallel military economy, one in which the functions of manufacture, armament, motive power, defense, and repair are folded into biological growth. The Tyranids do not build a platform and then install weapons upon it. The platform and the weapons are grown as one hostile expression. This creates one of the Hierophant's greatest strengths. Its resources are drawn from the same devouring system that feeds the rest of the swarm. Every battlefield corpse, broken garrison, stripped forest, consumed ocean, and harvested city may contribute indirectly to the creation of future organisms. The prey world is not merely conquered, it is converted into further military potential. The Hierophant therefore represents stored victory. It is the visible result of prior consumption and the instrument by which further consumption becomes easier. A human empire must move equipment from place to place. The Tyranid swarm turns the place itself into equipment. In combat, this resource model produces a severe strategic imbalance. Imperial defenders must preserve supply lines to keep fighting. Ammunition must reach batteries. Fuel must reach vehicles. Medici facilities must remain functional. Replacement troops must arrive through transport routes that can be interdicted. The Tyranids operate differently. Their forces still require biological support and synaptic cohesion, but they are not dependent on warehouses, landing fields, manufactoria, or railheads in the same way. A Hierophant advancing across a battlefield does not need ammunition convoys behind it. Its weapons are living systems. Its endurance comes from biology. Its replacement, if possible, comes from the wider cycle of biomass reclamation, rather than from a factory order. The strength of the Hierophant begins with its battlefield persistence. It can absorb punishment from weapons that would annihilate lesser organisms. It can remain operational after wounds that would destroy conventional armor or kill ordinary beasts. Its size allows it to dominate terrain, while its bio-cannons allow it to threaten fortified positions before reaching contact range. Its close defense systems make infantry assault hazardous. Its toxic emissions punish proximity. Its limbs allow it to cross surfaces that may disrupt heavier mechanical engines. None of these qualities exist in isolation. Together, they make the creature difficult to stop cleanly and expensive to engage. Administratum strategic models treated that expense as one of the bio-titan's most dangerous effects. A Hierophant forces defenders to spend rare tools. Titan support may be requested. Super heavy armor may be redirected. Artillery reserves may be exhausted earlier than planned. Airstrikes may be launched under conditions that would normally be considered inefficient. Orbital fire may be considered if friendly positions are already collapsing. Even when the creature is eventually destroyed, the cost of stopping it can weaken the rest of the defense. In this sense, the Hierophant's strength is not only that it kills, it compels the enemy to overcommit. The Mechanicus identified another strength in its biological integration. A machine can be disabled by severing power, rupturing fuel lines, destroying cogitator systems, killing crew, crippling joints, or penetrating the reactor core. A Hierophant has vulnerabilities, but they are not arranged according to machine logic. Damaging one limb may slow it without stopping it. Destroying a weapon growth may reduce its ranged output without preventing close assault. Burning armor plates may expose tissue, but the organism may continue advancing if its core systems remain functional. The proper disabling point may not be visible through smoke, swarm cover, and constant movement. This uncertainty makes battlefield targeting less efficient. Its military power also lies in the way it magnifies nearby Tyranid forces. A Hierophant by itself is a severe threat. A Hierophant within a swarm is worse. Lesser organisms use the disruption it creates. Larger beasts move under the pressure it imposes. Synaptic nodes preserve coordination around its advance. A wall breached by the bio-titan does not remain an isolated breach. It becomes an opening through which the swarm can flow. A defensive gun line distracted by the bio-titan does not simply lose focus. It loses the ability to regulate the tempo of the battle. The Hierophant therefore functions as a force multiplier, not through command authority, but through physical and tactical consequence. Yet the creature is not without weakness. Its scale makes concealment difficult. Even through smoke or atmospheric disturbance, a Hierophant can often be detected by movement, ground shock, auspex distortion, and the visual displacement of surrounding terrain. This gives defenders some chance to prepare concentrated fire before it reaches decisive range. Its size also makes it vulnerable to weapons built for killing super-heavy targets. Titan-grade armaments, heavy macro fire, orbital strikes, massed artillery, and coordinated air attack can destroy it if brought to bear with sufficient force. The problem is not whether the creature can be killed. The problem is whether a battlefield still has the time, discipline, and available assets to do so before it completes its purpose. Another weakness lies in its dependence on the wider Tyranid system. A Hierophant does not require a princeps or crew, but its effectiveness is tied to synaptic direction and swarm coordination. Disrupting synaptic control can degrade the precision of Tyranid behavior across many organisms. Against a bio-titan, such disruption may not make the creature harmless, but it can reduce the tactical intelligence behind its actions. The organism may still attack, advance, or defend itself, yet the wider purpose of its movement may become less efficient. For this reason, some Mechanicus and Administratum assessments recommend striking synaptic organisms near the Hierophant, rather than treating the bio-titan as the only priority. Its mass also creates logistical implications for the Tyranids themselves. A creature of such size represents a major biomass investment. If destroyed in a way that prevents reclamation, the swarm loses more than a battlefield weapon. It loses stored biological material, and the opportunity value of whatever else the biomass could have produced. Fire, plasma, melter discharge, sustained bombardment, and denial protocols may reduce the Tyranid's ability to reclaim useful remains. This remains difficult to execute under swarm pressure, but it is one of the few strategic ways to make the destruction of a Hierophant more costly to the Hive Mind. Administratum conclusions on faction strength were therefore cautious. The Hierophant did not make the Tyranids unbeatable, but it changed the threshold of response. A garrison capable of resisting ordinary swarm organisms could still be broken by bio-titanic escalation. A well-supplied fortress could become a death trap if its heavy weapons were insufficient or poorly positioned. A mechanized counterattack could fail if it was forced to engage the Hierophant while lesser organisms struck flanks and supply points. The creature's strength lay in forcing each local defense to prove that it possessed weapons suitable for a higher class of war. The Mechanicus conclusion was more severe. The Hierophant proved that Tyranid military power could not be dismissed as animal mass guided by alien instinct. It showed advanced biological problem-solving at a scale comparable to the Imperium's sacred engines. It replaced the factory with digestion, the armory with growth, the crew compartment with synaptic obedience, and the munition stockpile with living weapon organs. Its weaknesses were real, but they required disciplined exploitation. Its strengths were immediate and obvious to anyone standing before it. In combined assessment, the Hierophant represents a concentration of Tyranid resources, strength, and military intent. It is expensive in biomass, but the Hive Mind spends biomass where the return is judged worthwhile. It is vulnerable to the heaviest weapons of the Imperium, but those weapons are rare, contested, and often needed elsewhere. It depends on synaptic coordination, yet remains lethal even when that coordination is degraded. Its power is not limited to the destruction it causes directly. It changes how defenders allocate force, how commanders judge time, and how quickly a strong position becomes a failing one. For the Administratum, it is a crisis entry in the ledger of a dying front. For the Mechanicus, it is a living contradiction to the assumed supremacy of engineered war. The Administratum records surrounding Hierophant engagements are uneven, not because the creature was rare enough to be ignored, but because many of the battlefields where it appeared did not preserve orderly documentation. Reports often survived as damaged fragments. A fortress might transmit a partial request for Titan support, then fall silent before confirming the organism's final position. A regimental staff might identify a bio-titan crossing the outer defense belt only for the command bunker to be destroyed before casualty returns could be finalized. A Mechanicus observation post might record weapon discharge, chitin thickness, and gate pattern, but lose every attending savant before the analysis could be transferred. For this reason, the wars involving the Hierophant were rarely clean entries. They were reconstructed from collapse. Miral Prime remained the most important starting point for official categorization. During the Second Tyrannic War, the Dead World became a place where Imperial resistance against Hive Fleet Kraken produced records of unusual Tyranid escalation. The scythes of the Emperor fought there against the advancing swarm, and later archives associated Miral Prime with the first known Imperial encounter with the Hierophant strain. From an Administratum perspective, this mattered because it gave the bureaucracy a fixed reference point. The creature could now be named, filed, compared, and added to threat indexes. Before that point, a survivor's account of a walking mountain of chitin and bio-cannon fire might have been dismissed as battlefield exaggeration. After Miral Prime, such testimony required escalation to higher review. The results of Miral Prime were not recorded as a simple victory or defeat through the lens of the Hierophant alone. The wider war against Hive Fleet Kraken carried its own strategic complexity, and many records from Tyranid wars resist clean separation by organism type. Even so, the Hierophant's association with the campaign changed how later Imperial institutions treated large Tyranid sightings. Administratum analysts became more willing to classify certain Tyranid offensives as bio-titanic threats before absolute confirmation. This had practical value. Waiting too long for perfect identification could cost a world the time needed to request Titan-grade support. The lesson drawn from Miral Prime was not merely that such organisms existed. The lesson was that the Imperium had to assume escalation earlier than comfort allowed. Mechanicus' conclusions from the same category of war were more technical. A Hierophant appearing on a battlefield meant that the Tyranids were capable of opposing the Imperium's greatest engines through biological construction. This did not mean every Hierophant could defeat every Titan. No serious Mechanicus assessment treated war at that scale as a simple comparison of height, weight, or weapon count. Terrain, supporting forces, synaptic control, fire concentration, and timing all mattered. What mattered most was that the Tyranids had produced a form that could enter the same operational layer. The Hierophant forced god engines, super heavy armor, and fortress guns to answer a living target with the seriousness normally reserved for enemy Titans. The relief of Hive Jalon provided a clearer example of direct god engine engagement. In that battle record, the warlord Augustus Secutor of Legio Solaria worked with the Titan Gloria Vestator to bring down a Tyranid Hierophant. To the Administratum, this was a useful result because it confirmed that coordinated Titan action could destroy the creature. It also confirmed the cost of relying on lesser assets. If a Hierophant required warlord-class involvement to neutralize efficiently, then any theatre lacking such support had to be considered dangerously under strength once the organism appeared. The entry therefore served both as reassurance and warning. The Hierophant could die, but killing it demanded force appropriate to its category. The Mechanicus read Hive Jalon differently. The destruction of the Hierophant did not reduce the concern surrounding the organism. It clarified the engagement conditions required for success. A single unsupported response was not treated as ideal. Coordinated god engine fire, battlefield discipline, and controlled aggression were required to bring the organism down without allowing it to complete its purpose. Mechanicus notes from comparable engagements often emphasized that a destroyed Hierophant could still be a strategic success for the swarm if it absorbed enough fire, delayed enough Imperial assets, or allowed lesser organisms to exploit the battlefield while attention was fixed upon it. The death of the creature was therefore not always equivalent to the failure of its deployment. Other war records remain less direct but still relevant. During major Tyranid assaults against Forge worlds and heavily industrialized targets, bio-titanic organisms were repeatedly described in the same operational space as Titan legions and macroscale Mechanicus defenses. In such wars, the Administratum often recorded the result through infrastructure loss rather than creature identification. Manufactoria fell, Titan hangars were breached, Skitarii cohorts were consumed, defense grids collapsed under simultaneous assault. When Hierophants were present in these theatres, their individual actions were sometimes lost inside the broader ruin. This does not make them strategically minor. It shows how Tyranid warfare can erase the conditions needed for careful reporting. It is believed, though not always confirmed in surviving records, that some Hierophant deployments were used to test Imperial fortress doctrine rather than simply overpower it. This remains an inference based on repeated battlefield patterns. The organism often appeared where the enemy had concentrated its strongest resistance. It advanced against bastions, shielded gates, Titan approaches, and artillery-protected corridors. The swarm then adapted around the defensive response. If the defenders concentrated their heaviest fire too early, lesser organisms surge through weakened sectors. If the defenders held fire for a closer kill, the Hierophant's bio-cannons punished fixed positions before contact. If the defenders attempted withdrawal, the creature's presence could turn retreat into disorder by forcing an entire battle line to move at once. Administratum results from these engagements were grimly consistent. A world that reported Hierophant contact required immediate reassessment of survival probability. The creature's appearance did not automatically mean the world was lost, but it reduced the margin for error. Local command had to identify available heavy assets, confirm whether Titan support could be deployed, determine if orbital fire was possible without destroying critical Imperial holdings, and decide whether re-evacuation or continued defense served the wider war. The Hierophant compressed these decisions into a shorter window than bureaucracy preferred. It made slow authorization dangerous. Mechanicus' conclusions were harsher because they understood the symbolic and technical implications. Each documented war showed that the Tyranids could answer sacred industry with engineered biology. The Hierophant did not replace the swarm. It allowed the swarm to challenge the strongest points of resistance while still behaving as part of a living system. Its destruction in one battle did not prevent another specimen from appearing elsewhere. Its biological nature meant that every engagement was both a combat event and a study in adaptation. A successful tactic against one Hierophant might remain useful, but it could not be assumed permanent. By the end of Chapter 2's institutional assessment, the Hierophant stands as a documented escalation organism rather than a battlefield curiosity. Miral Prime established the category in Imperial awareness. Hive Gelon demonstrated that God-engine coordination could bring one down under the right conditions. Other Tyranid wars showed the difficulty of preserving clean records when bio-titanic organisms were deployed within full swarm offensives. The Administratum conclusion was practical. Any confirmed Hierophant sighting transforms a war zone into a crisis requiring strategic assets beyond ordinary planetary defense. The Mechanicus conclusion was more unsettling. The Hierophant proves that the Hive Mind can produce living war engines capable of contesting the Imperium's most sacred machines. The final result is not a record of invincibility. The Hierophant can be killed. It can be slowed, wounded, isolated, and destroyed by sufficient force. But every documented encounter shows that the question is never only whether the creature dies. The real question is what the battlefield loses while trying to kill it. A fortress may survive the bio-titan but lose its outer guns. A titan may destroy the organism but become exposed to the surrounding swarm. A regiment may hold the line long enough for victory elsewhere, only to vanish from the rolls afterward. In the cold language of Administratum and Mechanicus review, that is the true strategic value of the Hierophant. It turns survival into expenditure, and it forces the Imperium to pay heavily for every hour it remains standing. The Inquisition's impression of the Hierophant begins at the point where ordinary military interpretation becomes insufficient. To the Astra Militarum, the creature is a catastrophic battlefield organism. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, it is a living counter-argument to engineered supremacy. To the Inquisition, it is something broader. It is evidence that the Hive Mind does not merely overwhelm worlds through hunger and numbers. It studies resistance, applies pressure through appropriate biological forms, and escalates in ways that suggest a strategic intelligence capable of reading the structure of Imperial warfare. This impression does not rely on the assumption that the Hierophant possesses individual awareness. Inquisitorial analysis generally avoids that error. The creature is not treated as a general, prophet, warlord, or independent Xenos mind. It is instead examined as a visible symptom of a hidden intelligence. When a Hierophant appears, the question is not what the organism wants. The question is what the Hive Mind has concluded. Its deployment suggests that the swarm has identified a hardened node of resistance and chosen to answer it with bio-titanic force. In this reading, the Hierophant is not only a weapon, it is a message written in biomass, chitin, toxin, and artillery-grade biological violence. Inquisitorial observation differs from Administratum reporting because it pays closer attention to context before and after the creature appears. A conventional after-action report may ask when the Hierophant entered the theatre, what damage it caused, and whether it was destroyed. An inquisitorial review asks why it appeared at that location instead of another. It examines whether the swarm had already tested the defensive line with lesser organisms. It studies whether synaptic creatures had moved into positions that allowed clearer control of the bio-titan's approach. It compares the timing of its deployment against fuel shortages, ammunition depletion, civilian panic, command fractures, and previous failures in orbital containment. From this perspective, the Hierophant often seems less like an opening blow and more like the second or third conclusion in a chain of invasion logic. The Tyranids may first strip outer patrols, disrupt communications, seed terror through infiltration organisms, and force the defender to concentrate inside fortified zones. Once the prey gathers strength into a visible structure, the swarm can introduce a creature designed to break that structure. This does not prove conscious deception in the human sense. It does suggest that the hive mind understands how fortified resistance behaves when placed under pressure. The Hierophant arrives when the shape of the prey's defense has become useful to attack. Inquisition archives sometimes classify this pattern as predatory learning. The term remains controversial because it risks granting the Tyranids a form of strategic intention too close to human or demonic models. Still, the evidence is difficult to ignore. The same broad sequence appears across many Tyranid wars. Resistance hardens, the swarm adapts, larger organisms emerge, defenses designed around earlier phases become less effective. The Hierophant embodies the most visible form of this escalation. It is not the first answer the swarm offers. It is the answer delivered when smaller solutions have either completed their role or failed to conclude the war quickly enough. The conspiracy findings surrounding the Hierophant are less stable, but they persist across several sealed discussions. One belief holds that some hive fleets may deliberately withhold bio-titanic organisms during early contact, allowing Imperial defenders to misjudge the scale of the threat. This remains unconfirmed. Tyranid deployment can be explained by biomass availability, planetary conditions, synaptic range, or the practical difficulty of committing massive organisms before a secure assault environment exists. Even so, some inquisitorial analysts argue that the timing appears too useful to be dismissed entirely. The Hierophant often enters after Imperial command has already committed to a defensive posture, making withdrawal more difficult and reinforcement more costly. A second unconfirmed theory suggests that Hierophant appearances may function as stress tests against Imperial heavy assets. According to this view, the hive mind does not deploy the creature solely to destroy fortifications. It may also use the engagement to force Titans, super heavy armor, and orbital fire patterns into open action. Once those responses are revealed, the swarm's later behavior may adjust. This remains speculation. There is no recoverable Tyranid command archive, no intercepted doctrine, and no proof that a Hierophant itself gathers tactical data. However, the broader hive mind has repeatedly shown the capacity to adapt after contact. The possibility cannot be dismissed simply because the mechanism remains unknown. A third and more heavily suppressed suspicion concerns the survival of biomass after apparent Hierophant destruction. Inquisition teams have occasionally noted that battlefields where bio-titans fall become priority zones for Tyranid reclamation if the swarm retains access. This is not surprising. The Tyranids reclaim all useful biomass where possible. The more concerning interpretation is that even partial recovery of a destroyed Hierophant may preserve more than raw material. Some speculate that chemical traces, neural matter, or specialized synaptic tissues could contribute to later refinements. This remains unproven, and most Ordo-Xenos authorities treat it cautiously. Still, it explains why extreme incineration, denial bombardment, and quarantine of remains appear in several classified recommendations. Inquisitorial observation also pays attention to the human response around the creature. The Hierophant has a disproportionate effect on belief. Soldiers who survive its appearance often describe it in language that exceeds normal military testimony. They speak of inevitability, judgment, punishment, or a living tower sent to end resistance. Such statements are not accepted literally, but they are not ignored. Fear changes battlefield behavior. Despair spreads faster when a visible threat survives weapons that troops have been taught to trust. The Hierophant therefore becomes dangerous not only as a physical organism, but as a psychological rupture in the Imperial assumption that sufficient firepower can hold any line. This psychological dimension creates inquisitorial concern about contamination of morale and doctrine. A regiment that survives a Hierophant encounter may become harder, more disciplined, and more realistic. It may also become fatalistic. Commanders may overestimate future Tyranid threats and withdraw too early. Others may become obsessed with holding ground at any cost, believing retreat only feeds the swarm. Both reactions can damage Imperial strategy. The Inquisition therefore treats survivor testimony as evidence to be filtered, not simply recorded. The facts must be preserved. The fear must be contained. The most severe inquisitorial impression is that the Hierophant exposes a weakness in Imperial thought. The Imperium often categorizes enemies through familiar structures. Armies have commanders, machines have crews, beasts have instincts, fortresses resist until breached, titans dominate through sacred technological superiority. The Hierophant disrupts these assumptions. It is a beast without ordinary instinct, a war engine without machinery, a siege platform without a crew, and a strategic asset without independent command. It does not fit cleanly into existing categories, and anything that resists categorization creates danger inside Imperial bureaucracy. For this reason, conspiracy findings about the Hierophant often orbit one central fear. Some within the Ordo Xenos believe the creature is not the highest expression of Tyranid escalation, but only one visible layer of a much larger adaptive reserve. This remains unconfirmed, though it is consistent with the swarm's known pattern of revealing new organisms under pressure. If the Hierophant is a response to Imperial titans and fortress warfare, then the logical question follows: what response will the Hive Mind produce if the Imperium learns to counter the Hierophant reliably? The Inquisition does not answer that question with certainty. It records the possibility and prepares for the worst interpretation. The Hierophant is therefore treated as both battlefield threat and warning sign. Its appearance indicates that a hive fleet has entered a phase of direct structural assault. Its behavior suggests that the Hive Mind is applying calculated force against hardened resistance. Its destruction, while necessary, may not conclude the lesson the swarm has taken from the battle. In the Inquisition's coldest assessment, the Hierophant is not frightening because it is enormous. It is frightening because it proves that the Tyranids can translate Imperial strength into a biological problem, then grow an answer large enough to walk through it. Inquisition. Interrogative findings concerning the Hierophant are rarely drawn from direct examination of the creature itself. The organism is too dangerous to capture, too large to preserve easily, and too often destroyed under conditions that leave little usable biological evidence. Most interrogative material comes from survivors, command officers, mechanicus observers, penal auxiliaries, hive defense personnel, and rare personnel recovered from sectors where the creature passed but did not fully annihilate the surrounding force. These testimonies are inconsistent in language, but consistent in pressure. The Hierophant is remembered less as a moving creature and more as a battlefield event that reorganized every human decision around it. The first pattern found in survivor testimony concerns delayed recognition. Many personnel did not initially identify the Hierophant as a discrete organism. They described movement beyond smoke, rising shadows through ash, or a mass crossing the horizon behind lesser swarms. Only after its bio-cannons fired or its limbs became visible through the battlefield did most witnesses understand the scale of the threat. This delay mattered. Units under Tyranid assault were already conditioned to expect waves of smaller organisms, aerial threats, burrowing contact, and synaptic creatures hidden behind the front. A Hierophant entering the theatre did not always arrive with a clean announcement. It emerged through the confusion of an assault already underway. Interrogations often found that officers recognized the creature before line infantry did. This was not due to greater bravery or clarity. It was a function of access. Command posts received auspex spikes, vibration reports, artillery ranging errors, and pick feed fragments before individual soldiers could interpret what they were seeing. In several reconstructed cases, higher command began redirecting heavy weapons minutes before the bio-titan became visible to the wider line. This created a secondary morale problem. Infantry noticed the sudden shift of guns and reserves before they understood the reason. When the Hierophant finally appeared, many already knew from command behavior that something abnormal had entered the field. A second interrogative finding concerns the failure of scale perception. Survivors frequently underestimated distance when describing the Hierophant. Some believed it was closer than it truly was because its height and movement distorted battlefield judgment. Others believed it was farther away because the mind struggled to accept that a biological organism of that size could be advancing at such speed. This mattered for fire orders. Troops accustomed to judging range against infantry, armour, or smaller Tyranid beasts sometimes misread the time remaining before contact. Inquisition analysts treated this as more than fear. It was a cognitive failure produced by an organism outside normal battlefield expectation. The anomaly appears repeatedly in picked feed comparison. A camera mounted on a bastion or command vehicle would show the Hierophant moving at a measurable pace, while survivor testimony described either impossible speed or slow inevitability. Both impressions could be psychologically true while technically inaccurate. The creature's limbs covered large distances with each movement, making its advance faster than its size suggested. At the same time, its mass and height made every step appear deliberate. The result was a threat that felt both too fast to stop and too large to be moving so quickly. This contradiction became one of the most common features in survivor accounts. Inquisition review of documented encounters also recorded unusual silence in some testimonies. Not literal silence, because a Hierophant's advance occurs amid artillery, impact shock, collapsing masonry, and the noise of the swarm. The silence described by survivors was selective. Several recalled losing awareness of ordinary battlefield sound once the bio-titan entered view. Vox traffic, shouted orders, and nearby gunfire became distant or meaningless. This was classified as shock response in most cases. Some speculative Inquisition notes raised the possibility that synaptic pressure from the wider swarm may intensify the effect, though this remains unconfirmed. There is no direct proof that the Hierophant itself emits a unique psychic suppression field. The more cautious interpretation is that the organism's arrival coincides with high synaptic density around major Tyranid offensives. This distinction remained important. The Inquisition did not want commanders assuming that every fear response was caused by psychic attack. Such assumptions could lead to poor doctrine. Fear can be produced by scale, loss, exhaustion, toxins, failed weapons, and broken command rhythm. At the same time, the Tyranid swarm operates through synaptic control, and major assaults often contain powerful psychic organisms. The safest inquisitorial position treated the Hierophant as a physical center of crisis that may also operate within a larger psychic environment. The creature itself did not need to project terror supernaturally. The battlefield around it already supplied enough pressure. Documented encounters showed another recurring anomaly in close-range survival reports. Personnel who were near the Hierophant but not immediately killed often suffered from inconsistent descriptions of the air around it. Some reported chemical bitterness, burning mucus, or the taste of metal inside sealed helmets. Others described respiratory failure even when armor seals initially tested intact. This is consistent with records of toxic spores emitted from the creature's body. The anomaly lies in how uneven the effects could appear. Two soldiers in similar positions might suffer different outcomes depending on armor damage, wind direction, pressure changes from explosions, or exposure time. This made reliable safe distance doctrine difficult. The Inquisition therefore recommended treating all close proximity as lethal, unless proven otherwise by controlled instrumentation, and controlled instrumentation was rarely available during an active Tyranid assault. Interrogations of Mechanicus personnel added another layer. Tech priests and engine seers recovered from battlefields Where a Hierophant had fought, often described its weapon effects with unusual precision but emotional restraint. Their accounts focused on corrosion patterns, armor failure, discharge arcs, pressure waves, and the apparent organic ammunition expelled by its biocannons. However, several reports also recorded doctrinal distress. The creature's weapons were not crude acid sprays or simple biological projectiles. They behaved as integrated systems capable of defeating hardened material through combined impact and chemical ruin. To some Mechanicus observers, this suggested a level of biological weapon engineering that challenged basic assumptions about Xenos development. Inquisition interrogators treated this distress carefully. The concern was not only technical, it bordered on theological contamination within the cult Mechanicus. A weapon grown without sacred manufacture, yet capable of threatening engines blessed by ancient rites, could unsettle weaker minds. Such thoughts did not automatically imply heresy, but they were monitored. The Hierophant's danger extended into interpretation. If a Mechanicus observer began to see Tyranid biology as superior rather than merely alien and dangerous, that conclusion required containment. Admiration of Xenos efficiency has corrupted Imperial judgment before. Documented encounters with Titan forces produced different testimony. Crews and support personnel involved in God Engine engagements against Hierophants often understood the creature as a peer-level battlefield threat, not because it shared the majesty of a Titan, but because it forced similar engagement protocols. The case at Hive Gelon, where coordinated Titan action brought down a Hierophant, remained important to later inquisitorial review. It proved the creature could be destroyed by properly applied God Engine force. It also proved that such force might be required. For the Inquisition, this created a strategic concern. Worlds without nearby Titan support had to plan for the possibility that a Hierophant could appear before appropriate Imperial assets arrived. Some unconfirmed encounter files suggest that Hierophants may be deployed in a way that exposes Imperial heavy response patterns. A bio-titan appears, the defenders commit Titans, super heavy armor, or orbital fire, and the swarm adjusts around those revealed assets. This remains speculation. The same pattern can be explained by ordinary battlefield escalation, yet Inquisition analysts considered the possibility because later Tyranid assaults sometimes appeared to pressure support infrastructure after heavy assets were revealed. If a Titan killed a Hierophant but then found its flank overwhelmed, void shield support compromised, or ammunition routes cut by lesser organisms, the bio-titan's death may still have served the swarm's wider purpose. The interrogative conclusion was therefore cautious and severe. The Hierophant is not only encountered as a creature, it is encountered as a test of perception, doctrine, morale, and response discipline. Survivors misjudge its distance, commanders overcommit or hesitate. Mechanicus observers confront biological engineering that resists machine categories. Infantry morale bends under the sight of a living mass surviving weapons they expected to matter. Some anomalies can be explained through toxins, shock, smoke, synaptic density, or incomplete observation. Others remain unresolved because the battlefields where answers might be found are usually consumed. Inquisition archives preserve these findings because the Hierophant cannot be understood through destruction records alone. Knowing that a Titan can kill one is useful, but incomplete. Knowing how personnel react before, during, and after its arrival is equally important. The creature's strategic value depends partly on what it forces the enemy to reveal. It reveals fear. It reveals heavy weapons. It reveals weak command structures. It reveals which officers can still think when the horizon moves. The Inquisition's final assessment of these interrogative records is that the Hierophant should be treated as a battlefield organism, a strategic instrument, and an intelligence-gathering event for the swarm. Though the final claim remains unconfirmed, its appearance is never just an encounter. It is an examination, and the Imperium rarely chooses the terms. Classified Inquisition files concerning the Hierophant are not sealed because the organism is unknown. They are sealed because too much careless certainty around the creature can become dangerous. A battlefield commander may need a simple answer. It is large, it is lethal, and it must be destroyed before it reaches the line. The Ordo Xenos preserves a less comfortable answer. The Hierophant is a visible organism attached to a larger unseen process. It is a living siege asset, but it is also evidence of a strategic intelligence that continues learning after each engagement. To file it only as a monster is to misunderstand why it appears. The most restricted files do not focus on its height, mass, or visible weapons. Those details already exist in military threat archives. The sealed material concerns implication. When a Hierophant appears, the Hive Mind has already passed through earlier stages of assessment. It has measured the prey world's resistance through lesser organisms. It has identified where defenses concentrate. It has judged which structures must be broken quickly. It has gathered or allocated enough biomass to commit a bio-titanic organism. None of these conclusions require human-style planning in the narrow sense. They require pattern recognition, adaptation, and an alien form of strategic pressure. The Hierophant is one of the clearest expressions of that pressure. Several classified summaries describe the creature as a breach organism, but that phrase is deliberately incomplete. The Hierophant does not simply break walls, it breaks battlefield assumptions. It forces a garrison to discover whether its heavy weapons are sufficient. It forces a forged detachment to confront biological weapon systems that do not require sacred manufacture. It forces a Titan commander to answer a living target capable of occupying the same layer of war as a god engine. It forces governors, admirals, and generals to make decisions before their normal chains of approval can function. The physical breach may occur at a fortress gate, but the deeper breach occurs inside the Imperial method of response. One sealed Inquisition assessment argues that the Hierophant should be treated as a trigger for total theatre reassessment. This recommendation is severe but practical. A confirmed sighting means the battle has entered a category where ordinary defense planning may no longer apply. Ammunition reserves must be recalculated against bio-titanic pressure. Evacuation schedules must be reviewed without assuming that outer lines will hold. Titan or super heavy support must be requested before final confirmation becomes impossible. Orbital fire permissions must be clarified while friendly positions still exist in coherent form. Civilian containment, morale censorship, and command succession protocols must be activated before panic spreads through the population. Delay is often more dangerous than error. Another file, marked for restricted auto review, examines the possibility that the Hierophant's destruction may not always count as a strategic failure for the swarm. This remains an inference rather than a confirmed doctrine. The logic is simple. If the creature absorbs enough heavy fire to allow lesser organisms into a fortress, exposes the location of Titan support, forces the use of irreplaceable munitions, or disrupts command timing at a decisive moment, then its death may still serve the invasion. The Tyranids do not appear to mourn, preserve honor, or measure loss through individual survival. A Hierophant can die and still complete the function for which it was committed. This interpretation changes the meaning of victory. An Imperial record may state that the bio-titan was slain. That is necessary information, but it is not sufficient. The Inquisition asks what happened while it was being slain, which batteries revealed their positions, which void shields failed, which reserves moved too early, which civilians stampeded into transport corridors, which synaptic organisms survived while all attention fixed on the larger target, which commanders continued thinking clearly, and which became predictable. The Hierophant's corpse may lie on the field, yet the swarm may still have gained something from the encounter. Some classified files explore a more disturbing possibility. It is believed by certain Ordo-Xenos analysts that repeated Hierophant deployments across different theatres may allow the Hive Mind to refine how bio-titans are used against Imperial heavy doctrine. This remains unconfirmed. There is no direct evidence of individual memory passing from one slain creature to another. There is no captured Tyranid archive, no translated command language, and no verified mechanism by which a specific Hierophant transmits combat experience beyond ordinary synaptic integration. Yet the wider swarm has shown adaptive behaviour too often for the possibility to be dismissed. The safest policy is to assume that any tactic used against the creature may become less reliable in later wars. This is why denial protocols around Hierophant remains are treated seriously. Destroying the organism is only the first requirement. Preventing reclamation is the second. Chitin, weapon tissue, neural matter, toxin sacs, and internal support structures must be burned, atomized, quarantined, or otherwise rendered useless where conditions permit. Such measures are difficult during an active Tyranid assault, and impossible if the field is lost. Still, the Inquisition considers partial denial valuable. Even if the theory of retained battlefield learning remains unproven, denying biomass to the swarm is always strategically sound. Against Tyranids, nothing dead should be considered safely removed from the war until it has been made unrecoverable. The files also preserve warnings about interpretation among Imperial personnel. The Hierophant must not be described in terms that suggest divine punishment, demonic inevitability, or invincible predation. Such language spreads faster than doctrine and damages discipline. It is equally dangerous to describe the creature as merely a beast. That underestimates the strategic intelligence behind it. The approved interpretation is narrow and functional. The Hierophant is a Tyranid bio-titan deployed under the direction of the Hive Mind to break hardened resistance, absorb heavy response, and accelerate the collapse of fortified sectors. This phrasing removes superstition without reducing the threat. Mechanicus accessible annexes are more restricted. They warn against fascination with Tyranid biological engineering. Study is necessary. Admiration is not. The Hierophant's integrated weapons, self-contained movement, toxic defense, and massive biological endurance make it a subject of unavoidable technical interest. However, the Inquisition remains alert to the intellectual hazard of comparing living Xenos efficiency too favourably against Imperial manufacture. A weak mind may begin with analysis and end with reverence. The creature must be understood as hostile biological engineering, not as an alternative ideal. The difference is not academic. It is the line between vigilance and corruption. Several classified conclusions also concern planetary governance. Governors who conceal early reports of bio-titanic organisms to avoid panic or political consequence are judged to have endangered the wider Imperium. Underreporting a Hierophant can delay reinforcement requests until no reinforcement can matter. Overreporting can waste strategic assets, but the Inquisition generally views delay as the greater sin. A mistaken warning can be corrected. A silent fortress cannot. Worlds within Tyranid threat corridors are therefore advised in sealed instruction to escalate unusual sightings of macro-scale organisms before confirmation becomes absolute. The cost of embarrassment is lower than the cost of consumption. The final Inquisition conclusion is severe because it refuses comfort. The Hierophant is not invincible. It can be destroyed by concentrated force. It can be slowed through disciplined fire, weakened by coordinated heavy assets, and denied full value if the surrounding swarm is contained. Titan support, orbital fire, super heavy armor, and carefully timed counter-assaults can defeat it under the right conditions. But the creature's true danger lies in how little margin it leaves. It punishes hesitation. It punishes poor categorization. It punishes commanders who treat Tyranid escalation as a larger version of an earlier problem, rather than a change in the nature of the battle. The Hierophant also demonstrates the central horror of the Tyranid threat without requiring exaggeration. The Hive Mind does not need to hate the Imperium. It does not need to envy its engines or understand its faith. It only needs to encounter resistance, process that resistance, and produce organisms capable of overcoming it. The Hierophant is one such answer. It is grown from consumed matter, directed by an intelligence beyond ordinary negotiation, and committed where walls, tanks, and sacred engines stand in the path of consumption. Its existence proves that the swarm can answer the strongest defenses of a prey civilization without adopting that civilization's methods. In final classified assessment, any confirmed Hierophant sighting must be treated as a declaration of advanced Tyranid commitment. The creature's death should be pursued without delay, but its presence must also trigger wider containment, denial, and information control measures. Survivors should be interrogated for pattern data. Mechanicus observers should be monitored as well as consulted. Remains should be destroyed where possible. Battlefield outcomes should be measured not only by whether the organism fell, but by what the swarm gained while it stood. The Hierophant is therefore recorded as more than a bio-titan. It is a living index of Tyranid escalation. It marks the point where the swarm has judged ordinary pressure insufficient and has begun applying massed biological force against the hardest structures of resistance. To the administratum, it is a crisis of resources and survival planning. To the mechanicus, it is a violation of the assumed boundary between organism and war engine. To the Inquisition, it is a warning that the hive mind is still learning. The proper conclusion is not despair. Despair feeds poor decisions. The proper conclusion is readiness. When the Hierophant appears, the war has already become heavier than most defenders were prepared to admit, and the time to respond has already begun to run out.